Now, we're still in Unit 3.6, and today we're going to be looking at aggregate supply shocks. So when it comes to aggregate supply, what we're going to have is our other, instead of sig x, now we're going to have pig. So anything that helps our productivity, anything that affects our input costs, remember that's what you put into your product. Inflationary expectations. So if I think prices are going to go up in the future, I'm going to slow production. If I think prices are going to go down, then I'm going to up my production. And then government actions. And that can be taxes, regulations, anything that affects my business in a positive or negative way, as long as subsidies. And subsidies, remember, is where a government puts money into a certain area, like food and fuel. All right. So let's say we have a new cheap energy source. That is going to be a good thing, isn't it? That would lower the cost of inputs. So short-run aggregate supply would decrease. Now, if we're going to decrease short-run aggregate supply, they're going to ask the same questions that would have happened with aggregate demand. What's going to happen to unemployment, inflation, and GDP? What are those things going to do? So I know it's going to decrease. Remember, we always increase right and decrease left. So if I'm going to shift this one to the left, I'm going to indicate my new short-run aggregate supply curve and show my arrow leading to showing where the shift goes. So we're going to move from long-run equilibrium into a new short-run equilibrium, because that's where the short-run supply is going to cross demand. Demand is not changing. So now I see that prices are going to increase, and I go over and down, and then I see that our production is going to decrease. So if GDP is going to decrease, that means, therefore, unemployment is going to decrease, because we're not at work making supply, so we're going to have unemployment. Price level, as we can see on our graph, increased. Therefore, inflation increased. So that's our story whenever they ask, what's going to happen to inflation and unemployment? Okay, let's look at our next one. What if minimum wage increases? Well, that is also a cost to a business, and that's going to be wages. So if wages go up, then our supply will go down because we have a set budget. So we'd have the same exact thing happen. We'd decrease that to the left. Now, what if technology improves production? Well, productivity is one of the letters of pig. So if our production goes up, that means our short-run supply is going to increase. If our short-run supply increases, we're simply going to shift this to the right now. We'll have our new short-run aggregate supply curve. We're in short-run equilibrium. This pushes us out of the long-run equilibrium we're in. I can draw this dotted line over here. I see that price level has dropped. I do a new dotted line down here. I see that this is to the right, so that means that was an increase. So our output has increased. Therefore, unemployment is going to decrease. Price level decreased. Therefore, inflation is going to decrease. So this right here is a positive supply shock. This is a negative supply shock. Okay, this would be what we call cost push inflation, and this one will be demand pull inflation. So when you see those come along, you're going to get items that you can solve for when you look for GDP, unemployment, price level, and inflation. Okay, the other thing you're going to see is some multiple choice questions. They're going to ask you. They're going to have simultaneous shifts. So they'll say things like you have an increase in aggregate demand and a decrease in aggregate supply. So these are going to be the same types of things that we had, and they're going to ask what happens to inflation, what happens to GDP, or what happens to unemployment. Okay? If they ask you all these things in a simultaneous shift, treat it just like you would have when we did supply and demand simultaneous shifts. If you see one of these questions, be able to graph it out, because that's what the whole idea of the graphing is it tells the story. It problem solves for you. So understanding what happens in this storyline is going to help you answer a bunch of questions. So it'll say, like, what happens if you have an expansionary fiscal policy and a supply shock? So if we have that kind of supply shock, what's going to happen is this simultaneous shift would be enacted. And once we have that happen, the fiscal policy tools are going to have to be looked at. Well, is it tax increase or government spending increase? If that happens, well, let's go ahead and shift this so we can see what happens in the story. So I know aggregate demand 1 is going to shift to the right. Now we also had a supply shock. This is not a good one to do. So if we actually have a supply shock while demand is increasing, then I know our aggregate supply, would be decreasing. This would actually put us back. GDP would end up doing nothing, and we'd have inflation in the long run. But if they ask what happens in the short run, that would only be if these things lie outside of the long run aggregate supply curve. So just take these different combinations and figure out what happens to inflation, GDP, and unemployment.